Thank you very much. First, let me start by acknowledging the organizers of this evening's gathering. I cannot mention everybody by name, but I've had the advantage of listening to the men and women drawn from different countries across the continent of Africa who have given testimonies which speak to the residents of the mother continent in their hearts and minds. Let me also say how glad and humbled I am to have received this invitation to be present with you this evening and to share with you my thoughts on the role that the diaspora can and, in my view, must play in redefining the continent of Africa. It is very easy in a forum such as this and forums similar to this to talk about Africa as if it was an academic or intellectual curiosity. But that would be a luxury that one cannot and must not afford, because Africa is real. It is real because it's the resident of nearly 1.5 billion human beings who many years ago have passed through many tribulations. It is the home of Africans who at one time were enslaved. And one who wants to talk about history can talk about that, and many have. Indeed, as I walked here, I had the advantage of seeing some of the most celebrated books written by Anta Cheikh Diop, who speaks with greater depth about pre-colonial Africa. And one can talk about that. One can also talk about the history of the colonization of the continent and the impact that it has had and continues to have on the continent. But that is for another day. But yet there is a sense in which that colonization is what defines Africa in a fundamental way, because the project is still alive and well. When we talk about redefining Africa, it must not be lost on us that the continent continues to be divided and undermined because of that very recent history of colonization. We are the only continent in the world, as you well know, that still describes ourselves as Francophone, to mean that we speak French, so that if there was an African meeting, the Malians, the Mauritanians, the Togolese, the Beninois, the Gabonese, the Congolese, the Senegalese, the Tunisians, the Moroccans, the Chadians, the Burkinabe, and the Côte d'Ivoirians would describe themselves as Francophone. These are things that divide us and define us. And those who claim to speak English, Kenyans, Ugandans, Tanzanians, Sudanese, South Sudanese, Malawians, Zambians, Namibians, and many others, including Zimbabwe, would say that they are Anglophones. And that too defines us and divides us. When you look at the Portuguese, the Cabo Verdeans, the Guinea-Bissau, the Angolans, the Mozambicans would define themselves as Lusophones because they claim to speak English, or rather speak Portuguese. And that defines and divides us. There is something that today is also described as Arabophone. Those who speak Arabic. If you go to Sudan, Egypt, to a certain extent Tunisia and Libya, and even Mauritania, they define themselves as such. I will not have mentioned Djibouti, I'll not have mentioned Somalia, I'll not have mentioned Ethiopia, I'll not have mentioned Comoro, Seychelles, of Madagascar. But there is a sense in which that is how we define ourselves. One can speak about that when one is talking about redefining Africa, and those of you who are in the diaspora. In a manner of speaking, the African question and African condition can be said to be one that is properly understood and well written about. Indeed, many times when I have the occasion such as this to speak about Africa, my mind normally goes back to the 23rd, 24th, and 25th days of the month of May, 1963. At that time, 32 African countries had regained their independence or flag independence from their erstwhile colonizers. And the leaders who are present in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on that day, to the man, interpreted and understood the circumstances of Africa clearly and articulated the circumstances eloquently. That Africa, having been humiliated, having been abused by the colonizers, had three clear enemies: disease, poverty, and ignorance. That is how clear the diagnosis of the African problem was. And it was there the collective view of the leaders of the day that the entire independence movement was going to be designed to address those issues. That because we had been abused so much, we would not allow our health care systems to collapse. That the leaders were going to work to ensure that life expectancy improved. That they were going to ensure that maternal mortality was reduced. That they were going to ensure that infant mortality was eliminated, and fundamentally that the disease burden would be reduced if not eliminated. That is how clear the diagnosis was in 1963. They were also clear that ignorance was a contributing factor and that we had been so thoroughly undereducated or miseducated, as Carter G. Woodson had said a little earlier in 1933 of the American in his book, Miseducation of the Negro, which word you did not want to verbalize. And the most important thing was that we did appreciate that we had been miseducated, and so clear was the articulation of this. And if you go to many African schools and many African countries at that time, we built many universities. Those of you who come from Liberia or Sierra Leone will know that in those early days, the universities that existed at that time were universities such as Fura Bay in Freetown in Sierra Leone, which was a leading institution then and even now known as the Athens of Africa, because it was the residence of knowledge. That was Africa, identifying her problems. We also recognized that poverty was an issue, and we assumed that having regained independence, we would deploy our intellectual resources and our other resources to ensure that our men and women would not labor under economic desperation. Ghana regained our independence slightly over 60 years ago. And today, the question may be posed, has Africa conquered her identified enemies? Have the ghosts been exorcised? And if you look at Africa today, it is very easy to be depressed. It is easy to be depressed because, as I speak to you now, many African countries do not know peace. And if they know something that is a semblance of peace, it is merely a lull before some storm. Look at Africa now. Look at Ethiopia, which we thought was moving in the right direction. After the civil war in 1984, when the Derg regime had been eliminated, we thought that Ethiopia had been immunized against conflict. Today, there is a fratricidal war going on there in Tigray. People are now identifying themselves not as Ethiopians. And there is no problem with identity, but this identity is of the negative kind. Tigray, because they are Amhara, our enemies. There is no peace and quiet in that land with 100 million Africans, which is a resource which could be deployed effectively. And if today you ask a young Ethiopian in Mekelle, or in Lalibela, or in Addis Ababa, they would want to run away to some far distant country. And I'm quite certain that if you went to Eritrea, and you talk to some young man or woman in Asmara, they would want to run away to Dubai or to South Africa. But even in that South Africa that you want to run away to, look at what happened in the last 1 week. That country which was the beacon of hope, the home of the Cape of Good Hope, is now become the Cape of Hopelessness. Brother rising against brother, and suddenly that country that we refer to as the rainbow country is now producing thunder and lightning. And one wonders whether the dreams of the founding fathers of that nation, Albert Lutuli, Walter Sisulu, Governor Mbeki, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela and Chris Hani, whether that country will remain the country that we expected it to be. That depresses one. You go down, you go up a little. Only 1 or 2 weeks ago, in the only absolute monarchy in Africa, in Eswatini, you saw what was happening in the streets of Mbambane. Africa is not at ease. And you go up north in Mozambique, that great land of Eduardo Mondlane and Samora Moises Machel, up there in Cabo Delgado, we now have the entire population in disarray. This is Africa for you. And I'm trying to demonstrate that Africa can be depressing. And you don't stop there. Go to the eastern part of Congo. You know, about 2 months ago, the Belgians said that they were returning the only physical remain of Patrice Emery Lumumba, his tooth. Somebody once said that until they bury Patrice Emery Lumumba, Congo will know no peace. Perhaps. Go to the eastern part of Congo. That is perhaps one of the richest countries on the continent of Africa. But the Congolese are happier when they are in Matonge in Brussels, in Belgium. They are running away. That is Africa for you. And if you go up north, the Central African Republic in Bangui, unrest. You go to Chad, unrest. You go to Burkina Faso, that land of Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara, unrest. Go to Mauritania, unrest. Go to Mali, unrest. Go to Cameroon, the Ambazonians are not at ease. Go to Senegal, the Casamance, they are not at ease. Go to Nigeria. That is Africa. It can be depressing. And that is how I understand why many Africans sometimes leave the motherland in order to seek fortune elsewhere. But as Diosagifo Kwame Nkrumah said, even when you leave the mother continent resides in you. And that is why even when you are geographically separated from her, the good doctor, you must still have a medical scheme for your kith and kin several thousand miles away. That is why my good friend Lawyer Ongeri says, I cannot sit here in the comfort of Minneapolis, Minnesota. I must go back home and try to change the mother continent. You know, what you are doing is not new. Others have done it before. In the 19th century, Marcus Garvey of Jamaica tried to do the same thing. William of Trinidad tried to do the same thing. W.E.B. Du Bois tried to do the same thing. In his own unique way, Martin Luther King Jr. tried to do the same thing, not about physical migration, but about temperamental and intellectual migration so that you regain your self-esteem. Malcolm X tried to do the same thing. Stokely Carmichael, who was mentioned here, have tried to do the same thing. Louis Farrakhan tried to do the same thing. My good friend Al Sharpton tries to do the same thing. There is a sense in which that thing to make Africa work is something that we cannot abandon. And you know, throughout history. It is the men and women in different civilizations who sojourned in far distant lands that brought a breath of fresh air to their mother continents. The Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah was here as a student in Lincoln. That is where the spirit of Pan-Africanism caught him. Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria was here. And therefore, when we want and talk about redefining Africa, we must not allow what we consider to be the dark circumstances to dampen our spirit. This United States of America that many think is so great has gone through the valley of the shadow of death times without number. Is it not this United States of America that fought a war of independence? Is it not in this United States that you had a Boston Tea Party? Is it not this United States that had a civil war? Is it not this United States of America in 1963 that had a civil rights movement? Is it not this United States where George Floyd said, "I cannot breathe"? Is it not this United States? There is not a single nation on earth that does not go through trials and tribulations. Our Africa is going through our trials and tribulations. But even as we talk about those trials and tribulations, I can assure you that there are good things that are happening in the continent of Africa. If you have the honor and privilege of traveling through that continent, I do, and I see beautiful things. You know, in 1994, and many of you know this story, an Afro-pessimist had written an obituary about Rwanda after the genocide. Today, if you walk in the streets of Kigali in Rwanda, the streets are as clean as they are here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And that is only 25 years. Many people may say many things about that administration, but they have demonstrated that when men and women are committed to an ideal, they are capable of changing their country. So every time that you think that Africa is a lost cause, think about what the Rwandese did. A few years ago, many people thought that Tanzania could not function. You go to Dar es Salaam now, even if you doubt it, go to Dar es Salaam. Within 5 years of the presidency of Magufuli, you go and see the infrastructure that is there. And only 2 weeks ago, in fact, only 1 week ago, they have now ordered 32 electric engine trains from South Korea. Within 5 years, while it had been projected that Tanzania would become a middle-level economy in 2025, they achieved that 5 years ahead of time. It can be done. It can be done. You go to Namibia, in Windhoek, they may have their own problems, but you go and see that it can be done. Go to Botswana, it can be done. Go to Mauritius, it can be done. Go to Seychelles, it can be done. Go to Senegal, it can be done. In other words, there are things that are happening. Even in our own country, Kenya, we have our own problem that there are certain things that are happening which are positive. You cannot wish them away. Go to Uganda and you'll see a few things that are happening that ought to be celebrated. Even in the troubled Ethiopia, there are things that are happening that can be celebrated. And that is why I hold the view that in order to redefine the continent of Africa, we've got to understand that when you are looking at the life of any nation, never ever measure the life of a nation with your very short lifetime. You who are only capable of living at the very best at 400 years. How can you compare your life with a nation which will live for millions of years? You are just but a flash in the pan. You are here today and tomorrow we gather you to your fathers and mothers. So when you are talking about redefining Africa, think about Africa intergenerationally. I remember not so long ago, a year in fact, before President John Joseph Pombe Magufuli died, I had the occasion to have a long conversation with him at the State House in Dar es Salaam. And we had the occasion to talk about Africa. And he asked me, half in jest and half seriously, what I had meant when during the Julius Kambarage Nyerere lecture at the University of Dar es Salaam, when I said Magufulification, he asked me, what did you exactly mean? And I told him, this is what I meant. I meant that when I observed your activities before I met you, I got this feeling that you had successfully identified what is wrong with Africa, and that included, among other things, that we must regain our self-esteem. We must begin to believe that we can do things. We must begin to believe that we must take care of our health system. We must begin to believe that we can build our roads, that we can produce things that feed us, that we can add value to our natural resources. And I was saying that to the extent that you are faithful to that agenda, you are a Magulified person. And I believe that that is achievable if the continent has men and women who believe that Africa is capable of resolving her problems. And when we say some of these things, we do not for one moment believe that Africa is going to be a silo that does not deal with the world. We are simply saying that if we want to deal with the world, we must be prepared, because history has demonstrated that fortune favors the vigilant. And I remember once again, in direct answer to your question, what it is that can be done. In the month of April, I had the privilege of having a long conversation with the President of Malawi, President Lazarus Makathi Chakwera. And I told the President, the reason why I requested to meet you is because of the funeral oration that you gave at the funeral of John Joseph Pombe Magufuli. Because when I read your oration, you captured the mood of the moment. You are able to understand that in order for Africa to grow, Africa needs a certain kind of leader, a leader or leaders who are selfless. And therefore I come here to Malawi to ask you to give meaning to the word that you spoke. And he asked me, how do you want me to give meaning to the word that you spoke? So I give meaning by allowing our foundation to make Malawi the hub of innovation and invention, which can then be replicated across the continent of Africa. And he said, I give you that opportunity. And in the month of August, next month, I'll be meeting President Chakwera again to begin the process of creating an African hub for invention and innovation, which will then replicate across the continent of Africa. In other words, it is not enough, as you rightly said, to merely criticize, because criticize we can. It is not enough to merely critique, because critique we can. It is not merely enough to lament, because lament we can. It is not enough to intellectualize, because intellectualize we can. It is not enough to philosophize, because philosophize we can. But it is sufficient that beyond the lamentation, beyond the intellectualization,